There is something unsettling about places that should be empty but aren't. Hollow Station was one such place. Officially decommissioned in 1987, it sat on the outskirts of town, a forgotten relic of a bygone era. Yet, for reasons no one could explain, it never truly fell into decay. The benches remained polished, the signs never rusted, and the station clock, permanently stuck at 2:47 a.m., never gathered dust. Locals whispered about it, but few ever dared to venture inside. Ethan Wren was not one to believe in ghost stories. A journalist by trade and a skeptic by nature, he viewed the myths surrounding Hollow Station as nothing more than local superstition. When he was assigned to write a piece on urban legends that refused to die, he chose the station as his subject, confident he would find nothing more than an old building and a few overactive imaginations. On a cold October evening, armed with only a notebook, a flashlight, and a stubborn sense of reason, Ethan walked through the rusted entrance gate, past the yellowed "Closed for Service" sign, and into the silent world beyond. The first thing he noticed was the air. It smelled wrong. Not of dust and mold as one would expect, but of something disturbingly clean, like hospital disinfectant mixed with the faintest trace of burnt metal. He clicked on his flashlight and swept the beam across the empty platforms. There was no graffiti, no scattered trash, no signs of rodents. If not for the deathly silence, the place could have passed for a station still in use. As he moved deeper, his footsteps echoed unnaturally, as though the space around him were much larger than it seemed. The benches were perfectly aligned, their wooden surfaces unmarred by age. The train schedule board, cracked but legible, still displayed times and destinations for trains that should have stopped running decades ago. But it was the ticket booth that unsettled him the most. A single ticket lay on the counter. It was pristine, untouched by time, stamped with a date, October 17th, 2023. Today's date. Ethan felt the first stirrings of unease. He reminded himself that this could easily be a prank, left behind by another urban explorer or an overenthusiastic believer in ghost stories. Still, something gnawed at him, an irrational certainty that the ticket had been placed there for him to find. A distant sound broke the silence. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable, the metallic rattle of a train moving over tracks. Ethan turned sharply, his heart pounding. There were no trains. There hadn't been for over 30 years. Yet, as he listened, the sound grew louder, rhythmic, deliberate. He checked the tracks. They were intact, clean, as though waiting for something that had never stopped arriving. The sound stopped. The silence that followed was so profound it pressed against his ears. Then, without warning, the station lights flickered to life. Fluorescent bulbs buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow over the platform. Ethan swallowed hard. The station had no power. The city had cut it off years ago. He felt his grip tighten on the flashlight as his mind raced for an explanation. A soft rustling came from behind the ticket booth. Ethan turned the beam of his flashlight toward the glass window, but the interior was too dark to see inside. He took a cautious step closer. The sound stopped. Then, in the reflection of the glass, he saw it, just for a second, a figure, blurred and indistinct, standing behind him. His breath caught in his throat as he spun around, but the platform was empty. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He was alone. At least, that was what logic told him. But logic had begun to feel very far away. The station, for all its abandonment, was not lifeless. It was watching. It was waiting. And somewhere beneath the platform, something moved. Fear is a strange thing. It can creep up in whispers or crash down like a tidal wave. And at that moment, Ethan felt both. He stood frozen on the platform, gripping his flashlight like a lifeline, eyes darting between the ticket booth's darkened glass and the empty expanse of Hollow Station. The reflection had been real. He was certain of it. But there was no one there now. He swallowed the rising lump in his throat and forced himself to move. The rational part of his mind urged him to explain away the figure as a trick of the light, a distortion in the glass. The deeper, more primal part of him knew better. Something was here. He just couldn't see it. Then came the sound, a soft crunch, like a footstep on loose gravel. Not from the platform, but below it. Ethan turned toward the edge, his breath shallow. The station sat on a raised foundation, and underneath ran a labyrinth of disused maintenance tunnels and storage rooms. He hadn't planned on venturing beneath the platform, but now curiosity and dread fought for control. He knelt by the edge and shone his flashlight down between the gaps in the wooden slats. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a series of rusted beams, broken electrical conduits, and something that made his blood run cold. Footprints in the dust. They were fresh, leading deeper into the tunnels. Whoever, or whatever, had been beneath him had left a trail. Ethan hesitated. The smart thing to do was leave. To turn around, go home, and write a half-hearted article about an old, abandoned train station with a creepy atmosphere. But something about Hollow Station called to him. The train schedules still posted, the pristine ticket, the lights that had no power source. It all suggested a secret waiting to be uncovered. The sound of gravel shifting echoed again. Closer this time, Ethan's heartbeat pounded in his ears. Slowly, he backed away from the platform's edge, his instincts screaming that he was no longer alone. The air felt different now, thicker, heavier. He turned his flashlight toward the tracks, half expecting to see movement, but the rails remained empty. Then a whistle cut through the silence. Not a faint, distant sound, but sharp and immediate, as if a train were about to arrive. Ethan spun toward the schedule board. The letters remained unchanged, but his gut told him something was wrong. He flicked his gaze to the tracks again. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, in the distance, a faint shimmer, a mirage-like distortion along the rails, like heat rising from pavement. It flickered, wavered, then vanished. Ethan exhaled, his nerves raw. He wasn't sure if he had imagined it, but the uneasy feeling in his stomach only deepened. He needed answers. His eyes returned to the footprints beneath the platform. If someone or something was down there, he had to know why. He scanned the area until he found what he was looking for, an old metal service door at the far end of the platform. It was rusted at the hinges but slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond. Ethan took a step toward it, then another. His breath steadied, his resolve hardening. He had come to Hollow Station for a story, and now the station itself seemed eager to give him one. But some stories, he would soon learn, should never be told. Ethan had never feared the dark before. It was an absence, nothing more, a void that light had yet to fill. But as he stepped toward the rusted service door at the far end of Hollow Station, the darkness inside felt different. It wasn't just an absence of light. It was presence, thick and unmoving, like something waiting just beyond the threshold. He hesitated with his hand on the cold metal handle, his flashlight's beam barely cutting into the gloom. He told himself this was nothing more than an abandoned maintenance tunnel, filled with old equipment and dust. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. Something had been walking beneath the platform, and if he opened this door, he might come face to face with it. Taking a breath, he pulled the door open. It groaned on its hinges, the sound swallowed by the emptiness beyond. He stepped inside. The air changed immediately, stale and cold, tinged with something metallic. The tunnel stretched forward, the walls lined with corroded pipes and faded warning signs. He let the door close behind him, and for a moment, he felt truly alone. Then he saw the graffiti. At first glance, it was like any other forgotten wall in an abandoned place, covered in layers of old, faded spray paint. But something about these markings made his stomach tighten. The words weren't random tags or names scrawled by teenagers. They were sentences written in jagged black ink, stretching across the length of the tunnel. Don't listen to the conductor. The train isn't real. IT comes at 2:47. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The last message sent a chill down his spine. 2:47 a.m. The exact time frozen on the station's clock. His flashlight wavered as he traced the letters with his eyes, searching for any sign of who might have written them. The words looked rushed, frantic, as if someone had been trying to warn anyone who wandered down here. A new sound broke the silence. Not footsteps this time, breathing. It was faint, but unmistakable, coming from somewhere deeper in the tunnel. Ethan turned sharply, his flashlight beam bouncing off the damp walls. His pulse hammered in his ears as he scanned the darkness, but there was no one there. The tunnel stretched on, the graffiti messages growing denser, more chaotic. Some of them were smeared, as if someone had tried to wipe them away. He took a cautious step forward, then another. His instinct screamed for him to turn back, to leave Hollow Station behind. But the pull of the unknown was stronger. His mind raced with possibilities. Was this an elaborate hoax? A forgotten relic of someone else's obsession? Or was it something worse? The breathing stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. Ethan held still, waiting, his flashlight trembling slightly in his grip. Then, just as he was about to turn back, something moved at the very edge of the tunnel. A shadow shifting against the wall. And then, before he could process what he had seen, the station's whistle blew. Sharp, urgent, and impossibly close. The whistle's scream sent a jolt of terror through Ethan's body. It wasn't distant or distorted by time. It was loud, clear, and coming from directly above him. A train moving through Hollow Station. He turned sharply, his breath shallow, heart pounding against his ribs. The sound of metal grinding against metal vibrated through the tunnel walls, rattling the corroded pipes. But that was impossible. The station had been abandoned for decades. No train had run these tracks since before he was born. Ignoring the dread pooling in his stomach, he sprinted back toward the service door. Each step sent echoes bouncing down the tunnel, merging with the phantom screech of wheels above. His flashlight beam danced wildly, illuminating the graffiti-covered walls, the warnings smeared in frantic strokes. "Don't listen to the conductor." The words seemed to pulse as he passed them, as if trying to hold him back. The moment he reached the door, he shoved it open and stumbled onto the platform. The air felt charged, electric, heavy with something unseen. And then he saw it. A train sat at Hollow Station. It shouldn't have been there. It couldn't have been there. But there it was, a long, hulking engine of tarnished metal and grime-covered windows, stretching along the platform as if it had always been waiting. The headlights glowed dimly, flickering like dying embers. Faded lettering adorned the side of the nearest car, but the years had worn them away, leaving only ghostly remnants of whatever name the train once bore. Ethan's mind raced for an explanation. Was this an old maintenance train? An illusion caused by exhaustion? But when he took a step closer, the ground beneath him vibrated, the scent of burning coal filling the air. This was real. The doors of the train slid open with a mechanical hiss, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. Cold air rushed out, carrying with it a whisper of something faint, something familiar. A voice? No, a chorus. Dozens of voices murmuring at once, their words impossible to separate. Ethan's body screamed for him to run, but his feet remained rooted. Every logical thought told him to leave Hollow Station behind, to forget he had ever seen this impossible train. But something deeper, something ancient pulled at him. Then from inside the train movement, a shape, tall, shadowed, stepped forward, its presence wrong in a way Ethan couldn't define. He squinted, trying to make out details, but the figure remained obscured in darkness. A voice, low and calm, drifted from the doorway. "You're late." Ethan's breath hitched. The words sent a shiver down his spine, not just because they were unexpected, but because they felt personal, as if the figure had been waiting for him specifically. The train's whistle screamed again, a deafening sound that rattled the station's very foundations. The platform beneath him felt unsteady, as if reality itself wavered for a brief moment. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the train began to move. The doors started to slide shut. The figure in the doorway did not move, did not step forward. It simply watched. Without thinking, without understanding why, Ethan ran toward the closing doors. Ethan's body moved before his mind could stop him. His feet pounded against the platform, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the train doors slid shut. He didn't know why he was running toward them. Some instinct deeper than reason, more primal than fear, screamed that he had to get on. Just as the gap between the doors narrowed, he lunged forward. His fingers grazed the cold metal as the door slammed shut behind him with a suffocating hiss. A final whistle pierced the stale air of Hollow Station, and with a lurch that nearly knocked him off balance, the train began to move. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of rust, old paper, and something faintly decayed. The dim lights overhead flickered erratically, barely illuminating the narrow aisle ahead. Rows of cracked leather seats lined both sides of the car, their surfaces worn and split. Dust clung to the windows, obscuring whatever lay beyond. Ethan turned, expecting to see the figure that had spoken to him. But the space where it had stood was empty. He was alone. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. The train rumbled beneath his feet, the motion oddly uneven, as if the tracks themselves were warped or incomplete. Slowly, he took a step forward. His footsteps were swallowed by the heavy silence. Then he saw it, a coat draped over one of the seats. Dark, heavy, with buttons that gleamed dully in the failing light. It was the kind of thing a train conductor might wear. But there was no one sitting beneath it. No hat, no hands, just an empty coat, arranged too deliberately to have been abandoned. Ethan's stomach twisted. He reached out, hesitated, then carefully lifted the coat. Beneath it, pressed into the cracked leather seat, was a notebook. The pages were brittle with age, filled with scribbled handwriting that had bled into the paper. He flipped to the first page. This train does not stop. It only collects. If you boarded by mistake, find the conductor before he finds you. Ethan's breath hitched. His fingers trembled as he turned the page. The next entry was scrawled hastily, the ink smudged in places. The passengers do not remember they are dead. Do not talk to them. Do not let them notice you. Do not. The sentence trailed off in a jagged slash of ink. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears. He turned his head slowly, his skin prickling as if unseen eyes were suddenly upon him. The train car was still empty, but the seats behind him weren't. They had been vacant when he stepped in. Now, shadowed figures sat in them, motionless, silent, their faces turned toward him. The train rumbled on, swallowing his breath with its endless, rhythmic motion. Ethan's breath hitched in his throat. The train car had been empty moments ago, but now the seats were filled with shadowed figures. They sat unnaturally still, their faces turned in his direction, as if they had always been watching. The dim, flickering lights did little to reveal their features. Their clothing was old-fashioned, moth-eaten, and covered in layers of dust, as though they had been sitting there for decades, waiting. His fingers clenched around the brittle pages of the notebook. The words "do not talk to them. Do not let them notice you," pulsed in his mind like a warning siren. But they had already noticed him. He was sure of it. He swallowed, his throat painfully dry. Stay calm. Maybe if he kept moving, if he pretended not to see them, they would ignore him. Slowly, carefully, he took a step forward. The floor creaked beneath his weight. The figures didn't move. Another step. Still, they remained frozen. Their heads were tilted slightly, their blank expressions unreadable. But Ethan could feel something shifting in the air, like a tension being pulled tight. He turned his eyes forward and focused on the door at the end of the car. If this was a train, there had to be another car, maybe even an engine where he could find answers, or a way out. He forced his legs to move, step by step, past the silent passengers. Then a sound, a whisper. It came from his left, barely a breath of sound, but he heard it. His body stiffened. Do not talk to them. The words in the notebook flashed through his mind again, stronger this time. Do not let them notice you. But they had noticed him, and now one of them had spoken. His head turned involuntarily, his survival instincts clashing with his paralyzing fear. His gaze landed on a woman seated by the window. Her face was pale, lips barely parted, her hands clutching something in her lap. A ticket, yellowed, brittle, and covered in faint, smeared ink. She whispered again, her voice dry, as if her throat hadn't known moisture in years. This isn't my stop. Ethan's stomach clenched. The words felt wrong, like they weren't meant for him. But before he could process them, a new sound filled the car movement. The other passengers had turned their heads all at once, the creaking of their necks cutting through the thick silence. Now, they were all looking at him. Panic surged through his veins. He needed to get out of this car now. He forced himself forward, his pace quickening. The train rocked beneath him, and for a split second he thought he heard something beneath the floorboards, something crawling. His hand grasped the cold metal of the door handle. He yanked it hard. Locked. Behind him, the whispering had grown. A dozen hushed voices, murmuring things he couldn't understand. The train car was closing in around him, the air turning suffocatingly thick. And then the lights flickered out. The whispering stopped, and in the darkness, Ethan felt something standing right behind him. The moment the lights went out, the train car became an abyss. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the whispering stopped, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt alive. He could hear nothing but the unsteady thump of his own heartbeat. And then he felt it, a presence. Right behind him, the air had changed, thickening with something he couldn't name. The sensation was primal. A predator had entered the space. Ethan's spine locked as an unnatural chill crawled up his neck, settling at the base of his skull like icy fingers pressing into his skin. He wanted to turn, to run, to do anything but stand there frozen in terror, yet something inside him screamed, "Do not move." A slow, deliberate sound broke the silence. A dragging noise, like something shifting across the floor behind him, heavy and wet. It moved closer. Ethan gritted his teeth, every muscle in his body coiled tight. The notebook's warning echoed in his mind. Do not let them notice you. But the thing behind him wasn't just noticing him, it was coming for him. The sound stopped. For a breathless moment, there was nothing. No movement, no whispering, just the deafening hum of the train car pressing down on him. And then a breath, right against his ear, cold and slow, as if something was inhaling his very existence. Run! His body moved before his mind caught up. He threw himself forward, blindly reaching for the door again. The metal handle was unyielding, but desperation made him reckless. He slammed his shoulder into it, the old rusted frame groaning under the force. Locked. Still locked. Behind him, the dragging sound started again, faster now, more urgent. Ethan yanked at the door, his fingers burning against the cold metal. He didn't dare look back. He couldn't. He knew if he did, he wouldn't understand what he saw. And understanding was dangerous. The whispering returned, but this time it wasn't coming from the passengers. It came from behind him, from the thing that shouldn't be there, a voice that wasn't a voice, more like a hollow, gurgling echo of something that had forgotten how to speak. You're not supposed to be here. Ethan's pulse exploded. The lights flickered back on with a violent snap, bathing the train car in a sickly, uneven glow. He spun around, his body reacting before his mind could scream at him to stop. The passengers hadn't moved. They still sat, motionless, heads slightly tilted. But something was missing. Whatever had been behind him was gone, but the air was wrong. The space where it had stood still felt occupied, as if it had left something behind. Ethan took an unsteady step backward, chest heaving. His fingers clenched around the notebook, his only lifeline in the madness. The whispering had stopped. The dragging noise had ceased. But deep down he knew the thing hadn't left. It was just waiting. Ethan stood in the center of the train car, his breath unsteady, his fingers still gripping the notebook like a lifeline. The thing that had whispered to him, that had stood right behind him, was gone. But its presence lingered in the air, thick and oppressive, like the smell of something rotting just out of sight. He scanned the passengers, still seated, still eerily still. Had they always been in those positions? He couldn't be sure anymore. The woman with the brittle train ticket remained by the window, her lips parted just enough to suggest she might whisper again. But she didn't. Ethan forced himself to move. The door was still locked, but he couldn't stay here. He turned back the way he had come, hoping, no praying, that the train car behind him would lead somewhere else. But as his eyes adjusted, he saw something that shouldn't be there. A new door. It was on the opposite side of the train car, where no door had been before. Its surface was old, the wood splintering, as though it had been ripped from another place entirely and forced into existence here. The handle was rusted but intact. There was no reason for it to be there, and yet there it stood, waiting. He hesitated. This wasn't right. He had just been there, just looked in that direction minutes ago. Hadn't he? Or had the flickering lights hidden it from him? The longer he stared at it, the more unnatural it felt, like something out of a dream that refused to fade upon waking. Ethan's heartbeat pounded against his ribs as he stepped forward. The notebook's warning rang in his head. Do not let them notice you. But this door wasn't part of the train. It was something else, something other. He reached for the handle. It was cold, colder than metal should be. He pulled. The door opened effortlessly. Beyond it, there was no hallway, no train tracks, no expected reality. Instead, there was a staircase leading down. It descended into darkness, deep and endless, the steps uneven and cracked, as if they had existed for centuries, untouched. A gust of air rushed up from below, carrying the scent of damp earth and something metallic. Blood? No, something worse. It smelled ancient, as though whatever lay beneath had been buried long before the train station had ever existed. The whispering began again, but this time it wasn't coming from the passengers. It was coming from the darkness below. A sick, crawling fear spread through Ethan's gut. Every instinct screamed at him to shut the door, walk away, pretend he had never seen it. But his hands wouldn't move. His legs wouldn't step back. Something about the darkness below felt like it was pulling him in, calling him, as if he had already taken the first step without realizing it. And then, from somewhere deep in the abyss, a voice rose. Not a whisper, not a murmur. A voice. Clear, loud, and familiar. Ethan, his blood turned to ice, because he knew that voice. It belonged to someone who should have been dead. Ethan's grip on the doorframe tightened, his fingernails pressing into the rotting wood. The voice, his sister's voice, echoed up from the darkness below, curling around him like an unseen hand, pulling him forward. Ethan, is that you? His breath came in shallow gasps. It wasn't possible. Sarah was dead. She had been gone for over a decade, buried in the cold, unyielding ground after the accident. He had stood at her funeral, had watched the casket lowered into the earth, had spent years drowning in the guilt of not being able to save her. And yet, here she was, or something pretending to be her. The darkness at the bottom of the stairs pulsed, shifting unnaturally, as if breathing. The scent of damp earth grew stronger, mingling with the metallic tang of something Ethan refused to name. He took an involuntary step forward, the notebook in his hand trembling slightly. Do not answer them. The warning flashed through his mind like a thunderclap. His fingers dug into the pages, flipping through them in desperate search of another rule, another clue, anything that would tell him what to do. But the words on the paper seemed distorted, their ink swirling in patterns that no longer made sense. Ethan, please, it's so dark down here. The voice cracked with pain, with longing, with something that sounded like Sarah but felt like something else. Something hollow, something hungry. Ethan clenched his teeth. He had to get away from the door, away from the thing in the darkness. But his body wasn't listening. His mind screamed for logic, for reason, but emotions clawed at his chest, dragging him deeper into the spiral of fear and longing. He took another step forward, and then the whispering began again. Not Sarah's voice. The others. The passengers. The ones who hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. The ones who had sat like statues, staring into nothing. Now they murmured in unison, their voices blending into an eerie, rhythmic chant that sent a shiver up Ethan's spine. He turned and his stomach dropped. They were standing now, every single one of them. The woman with the brittle train ticket, the old man with the sunken eyes, the boy who had been clutching the toy train. They stood in their seats, their heads tilted slightly, their mouths moving in perfect sync, forming words Ethan couldn't understand but felt deep in his bones. Something shifted at the bottom of the stairs. The darkness moved, thick and slow, like something crawling toward him from beneath the world. Ethan, Sarah's voice again, but this time closer. His instincts finally took over. He slammed the door shut, his hands shaking as he pressed his weight against it, his breath ragged. The chanting grew louder, the whispers overlapping into something inhuman. Then, silence. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. He turned slowly. The passengers were seated again. No one had moved. No one had spoken. The train hummed softly, as if nothing had happened. But Ethan knew the truth. Something had happened, and it was far from over. The silence that settled over the train car was suffocating. Ethan's eyes flicked nervously between the passengers, their stillness now more unsettling than ever. They sat like mannequins, their postures frozen in unnatural, rigid positions. Their faces, though expressionless, seemed to carry an eerie weight, as if they were aware of everything, yet chose to remain silent. Ethan could still feel the pull of the darkness at the bottom of the stairs behind the door, but he refused to acknowledge it. His heart pounded in his chest as he stepped away, taking slow, deliberate breaths to calm himself. He had been in this train car for what felt like an eternity, and every inch of it seemed to press down on him like an invisible force. He needed to escape. He needed to get off this train, but the question haunted him. Where would he go? Every door seemed to lead to more confusion, more terror, more uncertainty. The windows offered no answers, only blackness, a void that stretched beyond the tracks, swallowing everything in its path. Ethan felt trapped, as though he had entered a space where time itself had ceased to function properly. And yet, something about the stillness of the passengers kept him grounded. They seemed like shadows of people, reflections of memories long past, yet undeniably present. Ethan shook his head, trying to clear the fog in his thoughts. He was not alone here, not just in the physical sense, but also in the twisted reality that surrounded him. As he paced the car, his mind turned back to the notebook, the thing that had warned him, that had given him cryptic, fragmented rules. He thought of the door, the voice, the passengers, the other world lurking beneath. There had to be a way out, a clue, a reason why he was here, why this train, why now. But the answers seemed to evade him, slipping through his fingers like sand. The lights flickered again, briefly plunging the train car into darkness before returning to their dim, flickering state. It was as though something was watching him, waiting for him to make the wrong move, the fatal mistake. Suddenly, the low hum of the train's wheels shifted, and the metallic groaning of the tracks beneath him sounded different, distorted. The train car swayed in an unnatural rhythm, rocking back and forth as though caught in some kind of phantom current. Ethan staggered, grabbing the nearest seat for support, his heart skipping a beat. This wasn't right. This was not normal. A faint sound reached his ears. At first, he thought it was the wind or the squeaking of the train's old frame. But it grew clearer, more distinct footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing through the train car. And they were coming toward him. Ethan froze. He could hear the thud of each step, heavy and slow, as though whoever or whatever was walking toward him didn't need to hurry. They had all the time in the world. His breath caught in his throat as the footsteps grew closer. Then, as if the air itself had become too thick to move through, the train came to a halt. The sudden stop jostled Ethan forward, and he stumbled, nearly falling into one of the empty seats. The unsettling quiet returned, filling the space like a dense fog. But this silence was different. It felt broken, as if something inside it had shattered. The door at the far end of the car, the one leading to the next train car, was now wide open. Ethan had not opened it. The train car hadn't stopped at a station. He was still miles away from the last known stop. He could feel his pulse in his throat as his gaze flicked between the open door and the immobile passengers. Something was wrong. Something was moving in the dark. But still, they didn't move. The footsteps had stopped. The presence was gone, leaving only the suffocating silence behind. Ethan knew then that whatever force governed this place, it wasn't finished with him yet. Ethan stood at the threshold of the open door, his body stiff with uncertainty. The train car behind him, with its frozen passengers and oppressive silence, felt like a distant memory. Before him, the dark corridor that led to the next car was a yawning void, an unknown that tugged at the core of his being. His instincts screamed at him to turn around, to retreat back to the suffocating stillness of the other car. But something else, something darker, urged him to take a step forward. His feet moved before his mind could catch up, crossing the threshold and entering the darkened passageway. The train felt wrong. It wasn't just the oppressive atmosphere. It was the very motion of it. the sense that they were traveling, but not toward any specific destination. The train car he had just left had been a world in itself, a microcosm of confusion and terror. This new space, however, felt more like an open wound, raw and exposed. The lights flickered overhead, their dull hum barely enough to illuminate the path ahead. Ethan's eyes adjusted to the dimness, the edges of the passage blurring into shadow, and he couldn't help but notice how the walls seemed to stretch unnaturally, as though they had grown larger in the few moments since he had entered. The once familiar metallic walls had softened into something more organic, like flesh, scarred and torn. He swallowed hard. Behind him, the door to the previous car slammed shut, a loud, jarring sound that sent a sharp jolt through his spine. The noise echoed, reverberating in the air, but when Ethan glanced back, the door was already solid, as though it had never been opened in the first place. A wave of dread washed over him. He was now completely alone, or so it seemed. At the far end of the hallway, another door appeared. It hadn't been there moments ago. It was the same as the one that had led to the staircase earlier. Old, worn, and wrong. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he moved closer, the unsettling rhythm of his steps in sync with the strange, rhythmic thudding that seemed to come from deep within the bowels of the train. His fingers twitched involuntarily, and the notebook in his pocket felt like it was pressing against him with growing urgency. "Do not open the door." The words from the notebook echoed faintly in his mind, but it was too late. He was already standing before it. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of blackness beyond. It beckoned. Ethan's hand, as though it had a mind of its own, reached for the handle. The moment his fingers touched the cold metal, a low growl vibrated from the other side. It wasn't a sound made by any living creature. It was guttural, inhuman. Something ancient, something that should have stayed locked away. "Don't open it." The voice, no longer his sister's, no longer the haunting whispers of the passengers, came from somewhere deep in the air, close, too close. It was unmistakable. It was a command, but Ethan's body moved without his consent. The door swung open with ease, creaking on its hinges. Behind it, a small room stretched out before him, unlike any of the train cars he had seen. The air was heavy with an overwhelming stench of decay. The walls were covered in thick, dark stains, the floor slick with something wet. Ethan recoiled, but before he could retreat, the door slammed shut behind him, trapping him inside. Panic surged through him, but as he scrambled to the door, a low, guttural laugh echoed through the room. The voice sounded familiar, but it was twisted, distorted. His head snapped toward the far corner, where a shadow moved. Just a flicker, a brief distortion, before it vanished. And then, as if in response, the room grew darker, the walls pulsing with an eerie rhythm. Ethan felt the temperature drop sharply, his breath misting in front of him. He could hear his heart in his ears now, drowning out everything else. "You shouldn't have opened it." The voice was so close, it was as though it had come from inside his own head. Ethan froze. In the dim light, the shadow in the corner reformed into a shape. Human, but not. The figure was tall, its form indistinct and flickering, like an image on a broken screen. It stepped forward, its movement jerky, unnatural. As it came closer, Ethan could make out its features, but they were wrong. The face was too familiar, a warped, contorted version of someone he had once known. A face he had seen in the train car. The figure reached out, its fingers long and twisted, and as it touched his arm, the world around Ethan shifted again. The train was no longer moving. The air was thick with the sound of something whispering, something ancient, something waiting. In that instant, Ethan understood. This train, this place, was alive, and it was watching him, feeding on his every move. The questions, the confusion, the terror, it was all part of the trap. There was no escape. Ethan's breath was shallow, his chest rising and falling in erratic bursts as he tried to make sense of what was happening. The figure in the corner, its shape now clearer, yet no less disturbing, seemed to loom over him, its elongated limbs stretching impossibly in the dim light. Every inch of Ethan's body screamed to run, to escape the clutches of this nightmarish realm. but his feet remained rooted to the cold, slick floor beneath him. The face that he had once known, now twisted and corrupted, stared back at him with a hollow, emotionless gaze. The features seemed to ripple, as though the face was shifting, reforming, trying to become something new. Ethan could barely recognize the person it had once been. He had seen that face on the train. He had seen it, sitting motionless among the passengers, their eyes locked forward, their bodies unnervingly still. But this wasn't just a reflection of someone he had known. It was something more sinister, something that had been waiting for him. The room around him seemed to pulse with life, the walls rippling like water disturbed by an unseen force. The temperature dropped further, biting into his skin with an almost malicious chill. As if in response to the figure's movement, the darkness deepened, stretching toward him, swallowing the faint light overhead. "You shouldn't have opened it," the figure rasped again, its voice a grotesque echo. There was no warmth, no trace of humanity in the sound, just a hollow, disembodied tone that filled the air like a toxic cloud. It stepped forward, the sound of its approach like nails scraping across stone. Ethan wanted to scream, to demand answers, but his voice caught in his throat, stifled by the overwhelming dread that threatened to choke him. In the darkness, the train car felt miles away, a forgotten relic in a world that had twisted into something unrecognizable. The sound of the wheels, once a constant hum, had faded entirely, leaving only the unnatural stillness. It was as if the train had ceased to exist altogether. Ethan felt trapped not only in the train, but in time itself, caught in a loop where the rules of reality no longer applied. Suddenly, the figure reached out, a long, bony hand brushing against Ethan's cheek with an almost tender touch. The skin felt like ice against his own, and a shock of coldness ran through him, making his teeth rattle. For a moment, the world blurred. Time stretched. The figure's face flickered in and out of focus, as though it were nothing more than a mirage, an illusion that couldn't decide whether it should remain real or dissolve into the ether. "It's too late for you," the figure whispered, its voice growing louder, more intense. The words felt like a spell, an incantation designed to unravel Ethan's mind. He could feel himself losing grip on the present, his thoughts splintering. A part of him wanted to reach out and grasp the figure, to demand an explanation, but another part of him, the primal part, urged him to run, to escape before whatever force controlled this place could claim him. In a moment of clarity, Ethan remembered the notebook. He fumbled in his jacket pocket, his fingers shaking violently as he pulled it free. The weight of it in his hand felt oddly grounding, as though it were tethering him to something real, something that hadn't been warped by the horrors around him. He flipped it open, his eyes scanning the pages, desperate for some kind of guidance, some hint as to how he could get out of this nightmare. The pages were filled with cryptic notes, warnings, and rules. None of them made sense. He searched frantically for something that might provide an escape, a way to understand what was happening, but the words blurred before his eyes. One sentence, however, stood out. "The door is not the escape." Ethan's heart raced as he reread the words, the meaning sinking in like a heavy stone. He had opened the door, but it wasn't the door that held the answer. It was something else. Suddenly, the floor beneath him shifted. A loud crack echoed through the room, and the walls seemed to pulse with increasing intensity. The figure stepped back, its eyes never leaving Ethan. The room seemed to stretch further, distorting, like an abyss that threatened to swallow him whole. Ethan's body was trembling, not from the cold, but from an overwhelming sense of inevitability. This place, this train, wasn't going to let him leave. It wasn't going to let him escape. The walls of the room closed in, and with a final, resounding crash, the darkness consumed him. For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw a glimmer of light, a fleeting spark that might guide him out of this place. But it was swallowed by the void before he could grasp it. The figure's voice echoed one last time, its words clear in the depths of the darkness. "The train has no end, Ethan. You're part of it now." And then everything went silent. Ethan blinked, his vision slowly returning to focus as the oppressive darkness around him began to recede. His head throbbed, the ache in his skull sharp and relentless. He was no longer in the room with the twisted figure, no longer surrounded by the suffocating void. But that didn't mean he had escaped. No, that would be too simple. The train hadn't let him go, and whatever force controlled it seemed to have found a new way to entrap him. As his surroundings materialized into view, Ethan realized he was no longer standing. He was seated, tightly bound to a worn leather seat. The walls of the train car were covered in grime, the same dark stains that had marred the other sections. The flickering lights overhead cast a sickly yellow glow, revealing the tattered remnants of an old world that had long since crumbled. His chest tightened as he tried to move, only to find his limbs heavy, as if shackled to the seat itself. Panic set in, but it was quickly followed by confusion. Had he been placed here by the same forces that had twisted the corridors? The train, once again in motion, hummed steadily beneath him, its rhythmic sway making the air thick with the sound of metal scraping against metal. Yet there was something off about the train's motion. It felt more like it was drifting through time, not space. Ethan's surroundings seemed to blur in and out of focus, a perpetual shift between moments of clarity and disorienting haze. The very concept of time was starting to lose meaning. How long had he been in the train? Hours? Days? Years? It didn't matter. The answer was irrelevant now. He was stuck, trapped in an endless cycle that seemed to stretch on without end. A noise broke through the thick, oppressive air, soft at first, like a whisper. Ethan stiffened, his breath quickening. He wasn't alone. Someone else was on the train with him. The sound came again, this time clearer. It was the faint sound of footsteps, deliberately slow, dragging with a haunting quality that made Ethan's skin crawl. He twisted his head toward the source, his eyes widening as a shadow crossed the threshold of the far door. The figure that entered was not unfamiliar to him. It was the same face he had seen earlier in the darkened room, the twisted, corrupted version that had reached out to him. But now it was different. The figure was somehow more solid, its form more real, as if it had been waiting for him to notice. It was not as monstrous as before, but its presence was no less chilling. It walked with an eerie calm, its eyes never once leaving Ethan's as it slowly crossed the car toward him. "You've been here before, haven't you?" the figure asked in a voice that was not its own. The words were soft, almost kind, but they carried an unsettling weight. The tone was familiar, yet distorted, like a memory trapped in the wrong time. Ethan couldn't reply at first. His mouth felt dry, the words stuck in his throat like a bitter knot. "Yes," he finally whispered, his voice weak, unsure. "I've been here before." The figure nodded, its face twisting into something unrecognizable, something too familiar. It leaned in, closer and closer, until its breath was on Ethan's ear, the rancid smell of decay filling his senses. "You never left," the figure murmured, a faint smile curling on its lips. "Not really. You've always been part of this train." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The implications of the figure's words hit him with the force of a thunderclap. His mind raced, the fog lifting for a split second as he tried to comprehend the enormity of what it had just said. Always been part of this train? It wasn't a metaphor, it was the truth. He hadn't just stumbled into this nightmare by chance. He had been brought here, yes, but he had also been chosen. The train was not a simple place of passage. It was an in-between, a liminal space where time and reality bent and broke. And now, he realized with growing horror, he was not the only one caught in its unrelenting grip. The passengers, the ones who had sat motionless, their eyes vacant, had never truly left either. They had never left because they couldn't. The figure straightened, its shape once again warping, flickering in and out like a faulty projection. "You see," it continued, its voice now slipping into a guttural tone, "the train never stops. It's a vessel for the lost, for those who belong to it." It paused, letting the words hang in the air like a slow-moving fog. "You've been chosen to stay. You've always belonged to the train." Ethan shook his head, his thoughts spiraling out of control. He had always assumed that the passengers, those frozen, vacant eyes, were victims of the train's dark power. He had thought they had been taken, claimed by whatever malevolent force ruled this place. But now, the truth was more twisted than he could have imagined. They weren't victims. They were passengers like him, trapped in this endless loop with no way to escape. "Why me?" he managed to croak, his voice breaking with disbelief. "Why am I here? What did I do to deserve this?" The figure's smile grew, its eyes glinting with a cold, empty light. "You didn't choose this, Ethan, but you'll never leave. Not now. You're one of us." The last words echoed in Ethan's mind, and in that moment, he realized that the train wasn't a means of transportation. It was a destination in itself. There was no end, no way out. It had claimed him, just as it had claimed all the others. They were bound to it forever, and now they would all remain, wandering its endless corridors, their souls trapped in an eternal, unending journey. And as the figure faded into the shadows once more, Ethan understood with terrifying clarity. The train was never meant to deliver passengers to a destination. It was the destination itself, a place from which there was no escape. The train seemed to move faster now, its vibrations more intense, as if it were charging forward towards some unknown conclusion. Ethan tried to focus, but the more he thought about his situation, the more the weight of his surroundings pressed in on him. The seats, the walls, the flickering lights, nothing seemed real. Everything felt stale, as though it had been abandoned long ago, yet still clung to a lingering sense of presence. He wasn't alone, but he couldn't escape the creeping sensation that he wasn't entirely alone in the way he understood it. In the oppressive silence of the train, Ethan's thoughts became louder. He was alone with the echoes of his own mind, lost in the overwhelming realization that he might never leave. It was hard to focus on anything except the monstrous truth he had uncovered. The passengers weren't just mindless husks. They were trapped, and somewhere in the bowels of the train, perhaps even in its depths, there was a hidden truth he had yet to understand. He thought about the shadowy figure he had seen before. There was something about its voice, its hollow words, that resonated with him in a way that he couldn't quite place. The way it spoke to him, almost familiarly, as if it had known him for years. Chosen. It had said he had been chosen for this endless journey. But why? The train jerked violently, and Ethan was thrown against the cold metal walls. He had been so lost in his thoughts that he hadn't noticed the sudden shift in momentum. His body screamed in protest, but he steadied himself, grabbing hold of the seat in front of him to prevent himself from falling. As he breathed deeply, regaining his composure, a soft, distant sound caught his attention, a low, mournful cry. It was a voice, fragile and desperate, echoing down the length of the train. Ethan froze, his heart racing. The voice was a cry of pain, faint but unmistakable. It sounded like someone begging for help. For a moment, Ethan wondered if it was just his mind playing tricks on him. The train had already warped his perception enough. But the cry continued, growing louder, clearer, as if it were coming from somewhere near the end of the car. There was no denying it now. Someone or something was crying out desperately. His pulse quickened as the sound reverberated through him, drawing him toward it with an invisible pull. He stood up, though his legs trembled. The motion felt strange, as if his body had forgotten how to move properly. The train didn't help either. The floor beneath him wavered like the surface of water, rippling in waves. But Ethan pushed forward. He had no choice. Whatever the cry was, it was a message, and he needed to hear it. With each step, the cry grew louder, more anguished, filling the car with an unbearable tension. Ethan reached the door at the far end of the car and hesitated, his hand hovering over the cold brass handle. Was this the moment he had been waiting for? Would he find an answer behind this door, or would it only bring him deeper into the hellish labyrinth of the train? With a trembling breath, Ethan pushed the door open. What he found beyond it wasn't what he expected. There was no empty car, no more passengers sitting silently. The space before him was different, a space that should not have existed in this broken, twisted train. It was a room that appeared as if it were frozen in time, a scene pulled from the depths of some dark memory. A station, not unlike the one he had first arrived at, but this one was frozen in its final moments. The dim glow of old lanterns illuminated the area, casting long, distorted shadows across the cracked floor. The walls were smeared with grime, the windows broken, but the air was thick with the scent of something old, something forgotten. In the center of the room, a train platform stood, abandoned, empty, and at the far end of the platform, Ethan saw something that made his breath catch. It was a figure standing completely still, its back turned to him. It was the source of the cry, the mournful wail that had echoed through the train. The figure's clothes were disheveled, torn, and stained with blood. Its head hung low, and Ethan could feel the air around him grow colder as he moved closer. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge him. But when Ethan reached out, his hand trembling, to touch its shoulder, the world seemed to hold its breath. The moment his fingers made contact with the figure's shoulder, everything shifted. The train's low hum intensified to a deafening roar, and the room before him twisted. Time itself seemed to bend, warping into something darker, more unnatural. Ethan stumbled back as the figure snapped its head up, revealing a face that was both too familiar and utterly alien. It was the face of someone he once knew, someone he had forgotten long ago. His breath caught in his throat as memories, long buried, resurfaced. No, it couldn't be. The figure, now staring at him with empty, hollow eyes, whispered a name. The name rang in his ears like a bell tolling in the distance, pulling him deeper into the abyss of his past. It was a name Ethan had never wanted to hear again, but now it echoed through him, and there was no escaping its call. "You left me behind," the figure croaked, its voice barely a whisper. "But I never left you." The walls of the train car began to fade, leaving only the empty platform before him. There was no more train, no more journey. Only the figure, staring, waiting for an answer that Ethan could not provide. Ethan stumbled back, his body pressing against the decaying walls of the platform, trying to distance himself from the figure that mirrored his past in ways he could not comprehend. The air around him felt thick, oppressive, as if the very atmosphere had been drenched in the weight of time and regret. The figure's words echoed in his mind, looping endlessly like a broken record. "You left me behind, but I never left you." He couldn't escape them. The words were not just a message from the figure. They were a reflection of his own inner torment. Who was this person, and why did they seem to know him so intimately? The longer he stared at the hollow face of the figure, the more the layers of his own memories began to peel away, revealing truths he had long buried. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. The distant sound of the train's incessant hum disappeared, replaced by an eerie silence that engulfed the platform. Ethan looked around, his vision blurring, as if reality itself were beginning to unravel. He could feel his own pulse quicken, the blood pounding in his ears, but the sensation wasn't enough to shake him from the stupor that gripped him. The figure remained motionless, its eyes fixed on him, unblinking, waiting for him to make a choice. "Who are you?" Ethan found himself whispering, though his voice barely broke through the suffocating air. The words were clumsy, heavy with confusion, and the figure didn't answer at first. It simply tilted its head, as if evaluating him. There was something deeply unsettling about its gaze. It was not the face of a stranger. It was the face of someone Ethan had known well, someone whose name he could almost recall, but not quite. The memories swirled in his mind, tantalizingly close yet just out of reach. Why couldn't he remember? The figure's lips parted, but instead of speaking, it let out a low, guttural laugh, one that seemed to vibrate the very walls around him. The sound was enough to make Ethan's stomach lurch, but it was also strangely familiar. It was as though the laugh had been a part of his own life at some point, something he had heard before, long ago. "Do you not recognize me, Ethan?" The figure finally spoke, its voice a rasping whisper that sent chills down Ethan's spine. The name felt foreign, yet strangely intimate. There was no denying that the figure knew him in a way no one should. "You left me, you abandoned me, and now you have returned." The words hit him like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs. Abandoned? He couldn't understand. How could he have abandoned someone? He had never chosen to leave anyone behind. The memories, the past, everything felt like it was slipping through his fingers, as though he were trying to hold on to something that had never been his to begin with. Why do you haunt me?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling now, barely above a whisper. The figure's expression shifted, and for a fleeting moment, Ethan saw a flicker of something, a pain beneath the hollow eyes. It was the slightest change, but it was enough to send a tremor through him. For the first time, the figure seemed less like an omniscient force and more like something lost. There was no certainty in its gaze, only confusion and sorrow. Was it not as much a prisoner of this place as Ethan? "You think I haunt you, Ethan," the figure murmured, its voice breaking the silence. "But it is you who have been trapped all along. The train, the memories, they are the chains that bind you here." Ethan's mind reeled. Trapped? He had always thought that the train was the source of his torment, the thing that kept him in this nightmarish loop. But the figure's words suggested something darker, something far more insidious. The train was not the tormentor, it was merely the vessel. The true prison lay somewhere deeper, somewhere in the recesses of his own mind. For the first time since stepping onto this cursed train, Ethan questioned whether the real horror lay within him. Had he been running from something, someone he could never outrun? Was he here, not because the train had brought him, but because his own guilt had led him here? The realization was almost too much to bear. The figure, now standing before him, was no longer just a specter from his past. It was a manifestation of his own unresolved regrets, a personification of the guilt he had carried with him for so long. "You abandoned me," the figure repeated, its voice quieter now, more resigned. "You abandoned us all." It looked around the platform, as though it were speaking to someone beyond Ethan. "We were never meant to be left behind." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the weight of the words settled in. Us all? Who else was there? He had never left anyone behind, had he? The past, like a forgotten dream, began to surface with painful clarity. Faces, names, places he couldn't remember, but knew he should. The train, the station, they were only the beginning. The real journey was to face the sins that lay dormant, hidden in the darkest corners of his mind. The figure stepped closer, its hand reaching out toward Ethan, and though its fingers were skeletal, there was a strange, magnetic force pulling him forward. He couldn't resist. "You left me behind, Ethan," it whispered one last time, the words reverberating in his soul, sinking deep into his core. "But now you must face what you've done." Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, he felt the pull of something much deeper than fear. He felt the pull of his own actions, his own past. And in that moment, he realized that the journey was far from over. The true horror of the train wasn't the terror of being trapped. It was the reflection of the soul, the burden of one's choices manifesting in ways more terrifying than any monster could be. And that realization, more frightening than any specter, would stay with him, lurking in the darkness of the train, long after the platform had faded from view. Ethan stood still, the chill of the station's air biting into his skin, his mind still reeling from the encounter with the figure. The weight of its words hung over him, like an oppressive fog, clouding his thoughts and threatening to suffocate him. His breath came in shallow gasps, and his heart pounded in his chest, but nothing seemed to clear the confusion that had overtaken him. The figure's final words echoed in his mind. "You must face what you've done." What had he done? That question circled endlessly in his mind, pulling him into an abyss of uncertainty. He had come to the station searching for answers, but instead he found more questions, more fragments of a past he couldn't piece together. The station, once a place of eerie familiarity, now seemed like a shifting labyrinth, one that could never be fully understood. The walls, the rusted tracks, the decaying remnants of forgotten journeys, all of it seemed to be a mirror of his fractured memory. As he stood there, grappling with the reality of what he had just witnessed, the sound of distant footsteps reached his ears. He turned, expecting to see the figure again, but instead, the platform remained empty. The train's engine still hummed in the background, its sound a constant reminder of the surreal nightmare he was living. But now, the train no longer seemed like the harbinger of doom. It felt like a haunting lullaby, drawing him in, beckoning him closer to the heart of his own torture. Ethan's gaze shifted to the far end of the platform, where the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, like a veil obscuring the truth. Something stirred in the darkness, a flicker of movement, a shape that was too vague to identify. For a moment, Ethan hesitated, the fear of facing the unknown clawing at him. But then, something deep within him pushed him forward. The answers were there, hidden in the shadows, and he needed to find them. He stepped forward cautiously, his footsteps slow and deliberate, his eyes scanning the dim light for any sign of movement. The station felt more oppressive than ever, the silence between the faint sounds of the train seeming to stretch on forever. The weight of his own thoughts was unbearable now, each step drawing him closer to the thing he feared most, the truth. As he walked deeper into the station, he noticed something strange. The station seemed to be changing, shifting in subtle ways. The walls, once weathered and old, now seemed newer, fresher, as though the years were peeling away from the space around him. The rusted tracks gleamed with a strange polish, as if they had been recently laid. The familiar decay of the station was being replaced by something far more unsettling, a sense of something being deliberately erased, as if the station itself was trying to rewrite its own history. Ethan's mind raced. Was this the work of the figure? Was it manipulating the station, altering its very essence in a bid to trap him further? Or was it his mind itself, distorting the world around him as it began to unravel? He reached the far end of the platform, where the darkness thickened. The shadows here were deeper, more consuming, as if they were hiding something, a hidden truth that only he could uncover. There was a doorway in the distance, barely visible in the dim light, its edges outlined in shadows that seemed to move. Without thinking, Ethan found himself drawn to it, his body moving on its own accord as if the doorway held the answers he so desperately sought. As he approached the threshold, the door creaked open, revealing a long corridor that stretched far beyond what he could see. The air in the corridor was thick and heavy, the walls lined with something that looked like ancient symbols, their meaning lost to time. The faint scent of something burnt lingered in the air, a sharp contrast to the coldness of the station. Ethan felt an urge to step forward, to uncover whatever was waiting for him in the darkness beyond. He stepped into the corridor, and as his foot crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind him, trapping him in the passageway. The sound was deafening, the walls vibrating with the force of it. He spun around in panic, but there was no way back. The corridor stretched endlessly before him, and the weight of the decision to enter it now settled heavily on his shoulders. There was no turning back. The further Ethan walked, the more disorienting the corridor became. The symbols on the walls seemed to shift, their forms blurring as if they were alive, watching him. The floor beneath him seemed to undulate, as if it were breathing in sync with his own ragged breaths. A low hum resonated from the walls, a constant pulse that seemed to sync with his heartbeat. Ethan's mind screamed in protest, but his feet continued forward. Was this another test? Another layer of his own guilt manifesting in a way he couldn't control? Or was this the station itself, distorting everything in a final attempt to break him? Then, just as the darkness seemed to be closing in around him, the corridor abruptly ended, opening up into a small, dimly lit room. The walls were bare, but in the center of the room stood an old mirror. It was cracked, its surface warped with age, but Ethan couldn't tear his eyes away from it. The reflection staring back at him was not his own. It was a younger version of himself, a version that had abandoned the figure in the station. The guilt was written on his face, his eyes haunted by the same fear that gripped Ethan now. For the first time since his arrival at the station, Ethan understood the truth. This was not just a place of physical torment. It was a place of reckoning, a place where guilt and memory collided. The mirror showed him not just what he had done, but who he had become because of it. And now, he had no choice but to face the consequences of those choices. With a deep breath, Ethan stepped closer to the mirror, bracing himself for the truth that lay within. Ethan's reflection in the mirror was distorted, warped by the cracks that snaked across the glass like dark veins. As he stood before it, the figure in the reflection seemed to move independently, mirroring his own actions, but with a subtle delay, as though it was trapped in a perpetual state of suspension. His heart raced, and a feeling of deep unease settled over him. This mirror, this cruel instrument, was showing him something he hadn't seen in years, a part of his past that he had long tried to bury. The reflection was not just a mirror of his physical appearance. It was a representation of his sins. As he looked closer, he saw that the younger version of himself was standing in the same place. Yet the air around him felt charged with a disturbing energy. The figure's eyes were hollow, their emptiness speaking volumes about the years of guilt and regret that had defined Ethan's life. A memory stirred deep within Ethan, faint at first but growing clearer with each passing second. He remembered the time he had left behind, his life before the train station, before the isolation. He had been running from something he couldn't name, a truth too terrible to face. He had abandoned those he loved, fled from the very people who needed him. The guilt had festered in him like a wound left untreated. And now, this mirror seemed to be reflecting not just his face, but the unforgiven version of himself. The reflection's eyes locked with his, a silent accusation in their depths. It was as if the mirror was asking him, pleading with him to finally confront the truth. Ethan's chest tightened, and the air around him grew heavier. The station, this place of decaying remnants and endless corridors, had become a prison, one of his own making. And the only way out was to reconcile with the past, to face the demons that had haunted him for so long. The weight of his past mistakes was crushing, the suffocating air pressing against him from all sides. He had tried to outrun it, to hide in the shadows of the station and its endless mysteries, but it was always there, waiting for him, lurking beneath the surface. The station itself seemed to respond to his discomfort, the walls shuddering slightly, as if acknowledging his inner turmoil. Ethan realized then that the station wasn't merely a physical space. It was a manifestation of his guilt, a place where the unresolved emotions of his past were made flesh. For the first time since his arrival, Ethan felt the full weight of his actions. His abandonment, his silence, the promises he had broken. These were the things that had led him here, to this station, to this cursed moment in time. He wasn't trapped in a physical space. He was trapped in his own mind, in the tangled web of decisions he had made. The station was not just the setting for his torment. It was the embodiment of it, a place that would not let him escape until he had faced the consequences of his choices. He took a step back, but the reflection in the mirror did not move. It stayed frozen, staring at him with that same hollow gaze, a mirror image that held his shame in its depths. Ethan turned his head to look at the rest of the room, but there was nothing there. The walls were barren, the air thick with silence. There was no exit, no way forward except through the reflection. For a long moment, Ethan was lost in the stillness, the only sound his own breathing, shallow and uneven. Then, as if triggered by some unseen force, the reflection began to speak, its voice a soft whisper that reverberated in the silence. "You cannot hide from this place," the reflection said, its voice almost familiar, like the voice of someone he once knew. "You cannot run forever. The past has a way of catching up with you." The words sent a shiver down Ethan's spine, and he instinctively took another step back. His pulse quickened, the room seeming to close in on him. He could feel the walls pressing against him, the air growing thicker with every breath. There was no escape, not from the station, not from his reflection, and most certainly not from the truth. The reflection continued, its voice growing louder, more insistent. "You thought you could outrun your guilt. You thought you could erase the past. But it's all here now, all of it, and you must face it." Ethan's mind spun. The words felt like a punch to the gut, and yet they were undeniably true. He had been running his entire life, running from the people he had hurt, from the choices he had made, from the person he had become. But there was no running anymore. The station had caught up with him, and it would not let him go until he had faced everything. He stumbled backward, his legs shaky beneath him, but there was no escape. The walls seemed to close in tighter, the shadows lengthening and stretching toward him. His own reflection remained motionless, yet its presence felt more real than ever. The truth was standing before him, and it was only a matter of time before he could no longer deny it. In the depths of his fear, a small flicker of clarity broke through. The station had been leading him to this moment all along. Each step, each turn, each distorted reflection, these were not random. The station was forcing him to confront what he had buried, and now he had no choice but to face it. The walls of the station, once a physical prison, were now a reflection of the walls inside him. Walls built of guilt, shame, and unspoken regrets. Ethan took a deep breath, the air thick in his lungs, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he made a decision. He would face the reflection. He would face the past he had tried to escape. There was no other choice. If he ever wanted to leave this place, this prison of his own making, he had to confront the very thing he feared most: himself. The air was colder now, heavier than it had been in the early hours of Ethan's arrival at the station. The stillness had deepened, becoming oppressive, as if the world had paused in anticipation of something yet to come. Ethan's mind raced with questions, but each one seemed to bounce off the walls of the station like a rock against an invisible barrier. There was no way out, no clear path forward. His confrontation with the reflection had not brought him clarity, but rather a deeper sense of confusion, as though he had taken a step closer to some forgotten truth that his mind was unwilling to accept. He stood alone in the dimly lit corridor, the flickering lights casting long, erratic shadows that danced like specters around him. His reflection in the cracked mirror lingered in his thoughts, but it was no longer the only thing haunting him. The station had become more than just a building. It had become a presence, a living entity that seemed to pulse with its own dark energy. It was as if the very walls, floors, and ceiling were breathing, suffocating him in a grip that tightened with each passing moment. Ethan had tried to make sense of his situation, to rationalize his way out of the madness. But the more he thought about it, the more impossible it seemed. The train station had once been a bustling hub, alive with the hum of passengers coming and going, but now it was a graveyard of forgotten memories and lost time. And yet, despite its decay, there was something unmistakably alive about it. Something watching, something that never allowed him to forget that he was never truly alone. As he moved further down the hallway, a faint sound began to echo in the distance. Soft at first, but growing louder with each passing step. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a trick of the mind, the groaning of the old building settling under its own weight. But as the noise grew louder, more distinct, Ethan could no longer deny that something was out there. He slowed his pace, trying to steady his breath, his senses sharpening. The sound was unmistakable now, a footfall, slow and deliberate, coming from just beyond the reach of his sight. His heart pounded as he hesitated, unsure of whether to continue forward or retreat to the safety of the room he had just left. But curiosity, that age-old companion to fear, drove him forward. With each step, the footfall grew nearer, and the air seemed to grow even heavier, as though the station itself was drawing him deeper into its clutches. As he rounded the corner, his breath catching in his throat, he saw something, or rather, someone standing at the far end of the platform. A figure, draped in a tattered coat, the edges of their silhouette blurred by the dim light. It was a shadow, almost too solid to be real, but too faint to be fully tangible. Ethan's first instinct was to call out, to ask who they were, but the words caught in his throat, swallowed by the oppressive silence that seemed to cling to the station like a shroud. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, facing the distant tracks, staring at something invisible in the dark. It felt like an eternity passed, the silence stretching, until Ethan took a tentative step forward, his voice finally breaking through the stillness. "Hello," he called, his voice a brittle whisper that seemed to disintegrate in the vast emptiness. "Who's there?" There was no answer, no acknowledgement. But just as Ethan began to wonder if his mind was playing tricks on him, The figure slowly turned its head, the movement jerky, unnatural, like a marionette with its strings pulled taut. Their eyes, hollow and dark, fixed on him with an intensity that sent a shock of ice through his veins. "You're not supposed to be here," the figure said, its voice low and rasping, as though it had not spoken in years. The words sent a shiver through Ethan's entire body, each syllable weighing him down further into a state of dread. Ethan's mind raced. Not supposed to be here? What did that mean? He had wandered through this station in search of an escape, hoping for a way out, but now, it seemed that the station had other plans. The figure before him, despite its eerie appearance, wasn't just an intruder in this space. It was a gatekeeper, a reminder that this place was not a simple station, but a space between worlds, a place where time and reality itself bent and twisted. "Who are you?" Ethan finally managed, his voice trembling despite his attempts at control. The figure took a step forward, the darkness around it thickening like a cloud of smoke. "I am the passenger," it whispered, its voice slipping through Ethan's mind like a cold, metallic thread. "I ride the train that never comes. And you are the one who has been waiting." The words made no sense to him, but they struck a chord deep within his chest. The idea of a train that never comes seemed to echo through his very soul, stirring a memory, one that was not his own. It was as though the station had pulled from the recesses of his subconscious and summoned this phrase, a phrase that spoke to a part of him that was long buried. Ethan's hands clenched into fists, the pressure building inside his chest, as if the air itself had thickened beyond recognition. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with every second. He realized now that it wasn't just the figure before him that had been waiting. It was the station itself, a vessel of forgotten souls, each one bound to the tracks, to the never-ending passage of time. The figure was not merely a person. It was an extension of the station, a being who had been waiting for someone like Ethan to arrive. Without another word, the figure turned and began walking down the tracks, its movements unerringly slow and deliberate, like the pacing of a predator stalking its prey. Ethan stood frozen, his mind trying to make sense of what had just transpired. Was this figure a warning? Or was it something more? Could it be that the station, with all its decaying splendor and silent corridors, had been drawing him in all along? The idea that the station was more than just a physical space, more than a prison, was now undeniable. It was a living thing, one that had been waiting for him to step into its grasp. Ethan stood motionless, the weight of the moment settling over him like a suffocating fog. The sound of the footsteps faded, lost in the echoes of the station, and for the first time, Ethan understood what the figure had meant. He had not simply stumbled upon this place. He had been led here, guided by an unseen force, drawn to a station that never stopped running, a station where the past, the present, and the future were always in flux. And now, the passenger was waiting for him to board. Ethan stood at the edge of the tracks, the weight of the figure's words pressing down on him. "I ride the train that never comes," it had said. But the implications of those words were beginning to settle in his mind in a way that terrified him. What train? What could it mean to ride a train that never arrived? The concept seemed paradoxical, something that shouldn't exist, but was somehow tied to the very nature of this forsaken station. In that moment, it felt like the walls of the station were closing in around him, not just physically, but metaphysically, pushing him to confront a reality that he had never been prepared to face. The figure had vanished into the depths of the station, its form swallowed by the darkness. Ethan found himself rooted to the spot, as if some invisible force had taken hold of him, binding him to this place. The faint sound of the figure's footsteps reverberated in the air, mingling with the distant clattering of the train tracks. It was as though the station itself was alive, breathing, and moving with an unholy rhythm that resonated deep within him. Every time the train's phantom echo reverberated, Ethan felt as though he were being pulled into a vortex, a swirling storm of uncertainty that left him gasping for clarity. He tried to shake off the overwhelming feeling that the station itself was calling to him, that it had been waiting for him for a long time. But the more he resisted the pull, the more he realized the futility of fighting it. His feet moved of their own accord, stepping further into the heart of the station, past the broken windows and crumbling walls. The world outside seemed to grow distant, as if this place existed on its own plane of existence, cut off from everything familiar. This was not just a forgotten train station. It was a realm that transcended the laws of time and space, where the past and future collided with equal force. As Ethan ventured deeper into the station, he noticed something unsettling. The echoes of his own footsteps were distorted, stretching and warping as though the station itself were twisting reality around him. The floor beneath his feet was cold, the air musty, and every flickering light above him seemed to carry the faintest hum, almost like a whisper. It wasn't the kind of whisper that could be heard clearly, but one that tingled in the back of his mind, urging him to listen more closely. But there was nothing to hear. It was as if the whispers were designed to distract, to lure him away from the truth he feared. Suddenly, as though the station had decided to answer him, the air grew dense with the scent of something familiar. Perfume. Not just any perfume, but one that Ethan recognized. It was the scent of his mother's favorite flower, the jasmine that had once filled the air of their old home. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. His mother had died years ago, long before he had ever set foot in this station. The scent was impossible, yet it was unmistakable. It was real, more real than the station itself. He turned around, expecting to see someone, but there was no one there. The corridor was empty, the shadows stretching along the walls in eerie silence. And yet, the scent lingered, growing stronger with each passing second. His mind spun, and for a brief moment he felt a surge of panic. Had the station somehow conjured this memory, this presence? Was this place somehow tied to the deepest recesses of his mind, pulling memories from his past to torment him? But before he could delve further into that question, a new sound filled the air, a train whistle. It was distant at first, faint and almost lost in the haze of his thoughts. But it grew louder, a sharp, shrill sound that pierced the silence like a knife. Ethan's heart began to race. He had not seen any train, no movement on the tracks, yet the whistle seemed to reverberate from every corner of the station, as if the sound itself were coming from everywhere. The train whistle continued, unrelenting, growing in intensity. His thoughts raced as he looked around frantically, trying to locate the source. Was it coming from the tracks? Was it a hallucination brought on by his fear? But as the sound neared, something far worse than a simple auditory illusion took root in his mind. He could see it, the faint outline of a train, appearing out of nowhere. It was barely visible, like a shadow, but it was real enough to make his skin crawl. The train was coming, but it was not the kind of train one would expect. It had no lights, no windows. The carriages seemed to be composed of swirling, opaque mist, a cloud of darkness that swallowed everything it touched. As it approached, Ethan could feel the ground tremble beneath his feet, as if the very weight of the train was distorting the fabric of reality. The noise of the whistle grew deafening, a sound that seemed to vibrate through his bones, threatening to crack him open from the inside. Ethan's instinct was to run, to flee from this grotesque manifestation of the station's twisted nature. But he couldn't move. His body was frozen, immobilized by an unseen force, as though the station itself was holding him in place. The train came closer, its form more distinct now, an amalgamation of shadows and memories that refused to let him escape. The figure, the one who had spoken of the train that never came, was standing once again at the far end of the platform. It was looking at him, its face unreadable, its eyes hollow, as though the train had already passed through it, as though it had ridden it countless times. Ethan's pulse quickened as the figure spoke again, its voice like a whisper carried on the wind. "Do you see it now? Do you understand?" Ethan wanted to shout, to demand answers, but the words caught in his throat. All he could do was watch in horror as the train drew nearer, the sound of its whistle consuming everything. Time seemed to stretch into infinity, and in that moment, Ethan understood. The train was not just a means of transport. It was a cycle, a loop, one that had been running for eternity. The passengers, like the figure before him, We're trapped on it forever, never arriving, never leaving. And Ethan was about to board. Ethan felt an unbearable heaviness settle in his chest as the train came to a halt in front of him. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and the station itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. He stood frozen at the edge of the platform, staring at the ghostly train that loomed before him. The carriages, cloaked in shadow and mist, were now only a few feet away, and the faint scent of jasmine hung in the air once again. This time, however, it did not offer comfort. It felt like an omen. The train's arrival was not a simple moment in time. It was the culmination of everything he had experienced, everything he had feared, and everything he had never understood. The figure, the guide, stood at the back of the train, its hollow eyes watching him intently. It had no expression, no voice, but Ethan knew it was waiting for him, beckoning him to step onto the train. He wanted to resist, wanted to turn and run, but his body refused to obey. His legs moved involuntarily, one foot after the other, as if drawn by an invisible force, until he stood at the train's threshold. The doors slid open silently, revealing the interior, a dark, empty void that seemed to stretch forever. With a final, desperate glance at the figure behind him, Ethan stepped aboard the train. The moment he crossed the threshold, the doors slammed shut with a force that echoed through his mind. He was surrounded by darkness, no windows, no seats, nothing but the oppressive silence that enveloped him. The train, it seemed, was not bound by the constraints of the physical world. It was a thing of nightmares, a manifestation of the very nature of this forsaken station, existing outside of time, outside of reason. The train began to move, but not with the gentle motion of a normal train. It did not follow the rails or tracks. Instead, it seemed to glide, shifting through layers of existence, moving faster than the speed of thought. The sound of the train's engine was deafening, a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate within Ethan's skull. The walls of the train car flickered in and out of existence, and for brief moments, he saw flashes of people, figures standing in the dark corners of the car, their faces twisted in agony, their eyes vacant. They were the lost passengers, trapped in the cycle, forever bound to the train, forever repeating the same journey. Ethan felt his stomach churn as the train descended into what could only be described as a void. The station, the platform, the world outside, all of it faded into obscurity. The darkness swallowed everything. Time itself seemed to collapse, as if all of his experiences had been compressed into a single moment of realization. This was not a journey, it was a punishment. The train was not a vessel for travel, but a prison, a never-ending loop that had claimed countless souls before him. Each passenger, each figure he had encountered, was a lost fragment of this place, caught in its twisted web. As the train continued its journey, Ethan's thoughts grew increasingly fragmented. The memories of his life, his mother, his childhood, the world outside, began to slip away, fading into the background like a forgotten dream. He could no longer remember the details of his past, the events that had led him to this forsaken station. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered. The only thing that remained was the train, the darkness, and the unrelenting cycle. The figure at the back of the car finally moved, its presence looming over Ethan like a specter. It spoke again, its voice a soft murmur that carried through the oppressive silence. "You've always been here, Ethan. This was your destination all along. You, too, are part of the cycle now." His heart skipped a beat. The words felt like a physical blow, knocking the breath out of him. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the words caught in his throat. He realized then that the figure's words were not meant to provide clarity. They were meant to confirm the truth he had feared all along. The station had never been abandoned. It had always been waiting for someone to step inside, for someone to become part of the cycle, for someone to join the lost passengers, the countless souls who had ridden this train before him. And now it was his turn. In the distance, beyond the shadows, Ethan saw something. A flicker of light, barely perceptible, but undeniable. It was the faint outline of another train, another version of the same endless journey. It was as if the train he was on was branching, splintering into infinite versions of itself, creating new loops, new paths for other lost souls to follow. The world of the living, the world of time, had no place here. This was a world of pure endlessness, where the destination was never clear, and the journey was eternal. As the train continued on its path through the void, Ethan felt his mind slipping away. The last remnants of his identity, the memories, the thoughts of the world outside, began to fade into the darkness, swallowed by the relentless hum of the train. The figure's presence loomed behind him, its voice an indistinct whisper, but in the end, it didn't matter. There was no escape, no turning back. He was part of the cycle now. And so, the train moved onward, its course set through the endless night, carrying Ethan and countless others toward an eternal, unknowable fate. The station, the train, the figures, they were all one. Trapped in the cycle, trapped in the darkness, there was only one truth left to face. Ethan was no longer a traveler. He had become part of the legend, another lost soul riding the train that never arrived.